Blood streaked across Margaret Sinclair's knuckles as her grip failed. The wagon bucked like a wild Mustang beneath her driver already gone, swallowed by Montana dust. Her fingers clawed at splintered wood, while the runaway mules dragged her toward the cliff edge at full gallop. She let go. Air rushed past her face. Pine branches whipped her skirts. The granite rocks below rushed up to meet her with the cold promise of broken bones. Strong arms caught her mid-flight. They hit the ground hard, rolling across stones and sagebrush until a fallen log stopped their tumble. Dust settled. Silence stretched between heartbeats. "You breathing?" The voice rumbled against her ear. Margaret opened her eyes. A man's face hovered inches from hers, carved from leather and weather. A scar ran white across his left cheek. Eyes the color of winter sky studied her, with the kind of attention a hawk gives a rabbit. "I think so." She sat up, testing her limbs. Everything moved. The driver— "Worry about yourself first." In the distance, wood exploded against stone. Her trunk, her books, her carefully planned future back east scattered like leaves in a windstorm. "Kane Morrison." He stood, offering a calloused hand. "Margaret Sinclair." She accepted his help, noting how he didn't release her fingers immediately. "You saved my life." "Maybe." His eyes swept the mountainside. "Day's not over yet." They found Henry Whitmore a quarter-mile up the trail, propped against a boulder with his leg bent wrong. His weathered face had gone gray, but he managed a weak smile when he spotted Margaret. "Thank the Lord you're walking, Miss Sinclair." Kane knelt beside the old man, hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Clean break. You won't be driving for months." The sun dropped toward the western peaks, painting shadows long across the valley floor. Margaret looked around at the endless wilderness stretching in all directions. No roads, no towns, no rescue coming. "My place is 3 miles north." Kane straightened, wiping blood from his hands. "I can patch him up proper there." Margaret's Boston finishing school education had covered many contingencies, but accepting help from strange men in the Montana wilderness wasn't among them. She studied Kane Morrison's face, searching for some hint of his intentions. He waited without fidgeting, patient as stone. "Very well," she said finally. Kane lifted Henry like the man weighed nothing, muscles shifting beneath his wool shirt. Margaret found herself staring at the play of sinew and strength, heat rising in her cheeks. "Can you ride?" He nodded toward a black stallion tied to a pine. Margaret hadn't been on horseback since she was 12, but she nodded anyway. Kane boosted her into the saddle, his hands spanning her waist completely. The contact sent fire shooting through her belly. "Hold tight to the saddle horn," he said. "Midnight's got more sense than most people, but he doesn't know you." They traveled through gathering dusk, Kane walking alongside the horse, while carrying Henry in his arms as easily as a child carries a doll. Margaret found herself studying the stranger's profile in the fading light. Something about him seemed familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. The ranch house emerged from shadow like something from a fever dream. Windows glowed golden. Smoke curled from the chimney. The lowing of distant cattle created music she'd never heard, but somehow recognized in her bones. A woman appeared in the doorway. As they approached, gray hair, pulled back, severe expression, shifting from curiosity to concern. "Another rescue, Kane. Wagon went over the cliff. Drivers busted up." The woman stepped forward, confidence radiating from her like heat. "I'm Sarah McKenna. Let's get you both inside before the mountain cold sets in." Within the hour, Henry was settled in a downstairs bedroom, with his legs splinted and dosed with laudanum. Margaret found herself in a guest room wearing a borrowed nightgown that smelled of lavender, and wondering how her orderly life had derailed so completely in the space of an afternoon. Through the window, she watched Kane in the barn, moving around his horse with the kind of easy partnership that spoke of years together. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up toward her window. Even across the distance, she felt the connection like a physical blow. Margaret stepped back from the glass, heart hammering against her ribs. She was alone in the Montana wilderness, dependent on a scarred stranger who caught falling women from the sky. The sensible thing would be to arrange passage back east as soon as Henry could travel. But as she lay down on the narrow bed listening to coyotes singing in the darkness, Margaret Sinclair discovered something that terrified her more than the runaway wagon. She didn't want to leave. What happens in Act 2? We'll discover why Kane Morrison looks familiar to Margaret and learn what really brought a Boston lady to the Montana territory in the first place. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and bacon sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a moment she lay still, remembering where she was and why. The borrowed nightgown twisted around her legs as she sat up, reality settling over her like a cold blanket. She was stranded in the Montana Territory with a broken driver and no way home. Sarah McKenna had left clean clothes folded on the chair. A simple brown dress, practical boots and undergarments that had seen better days but were serviceable. Margaret dressed quickly, braiding her dark hair into a neat plait. The woman in the mirror looked different somehow. Leaner. Her eyes held something they hadn't possessed in Boston. Downstairs, she found Kane at the kitchen table, bent over a ledger book with a cup of coffee steaming beside his elbow. He looked up when she entered, his winter blue eyes taking in her borrowed clothes with an expression she couldn't read. "Henry's asking for you," he said. "Fever broke during the night." Margaret found the old driver propped up in bed, color returned to his weathered cheeks. He gripped her hand when she sat beside him. "Miss Sinclair, I'm powerful sorry about your trunk and all. Lost everything, didn't we?" "Everything can be replaced," she said, though her heart clenched thinking of her father's letters now scattered across the mountainside. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule, but I'll live." Henry's eyes grew troubled. "Thing is, I can't get you where you're going. Not for weeks, maybe months with this leg." Margaret squeezed his gnarled fingers. "Don't worry about that now. Focus on healing." But when she returned to the kitchen, the problem loomed large. Kane sat exactly as she'd left him, ledger open, coffee cooling. He didn't look up when she took the chair across from him. "Where were you headed?" he asked without preamble. "Copper Falls. My father left me property there." The words felt strange in her mouth. She'd never spoken of her inheritance to anyone except Henry and the lawyers back east. Kane's pencil stopped moving across the page. His eyes lifted slowly to meet hers, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition flickered there, followed by something harder. "What name was your father?" Margaret's pulse quickened at his tone. "Thomas Sinclair. He was a mining engineer." "Why do you—" Kane closed the ledger with a snap. "Thomas Sinclair, who owned the Copper Falls silver mine until 3 years ago." It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. "The same Thomas Sinclair who sold out to Eastern investors and left 60 men without work when the mine closed." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "My father died of consumption in Boston 6 months ago. I came to settle his estate." Kane's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Sarah will see to whatever you need. I've got cattle to tend." He strode out without another word, leaving Margaret alone with her coffee, and the growing certainty that her rescue had just become infinitely more complicated. Sarah appeared from the pantry, her arms full of preserving jars. If she'd overheard the conversation, she gave no sign. "Men," she said simply, setting the jars on the counter. "They hold grudges like other folks hold breath. Can't seem to let them go without turning blue. He knew my father. Kane knows everyone in 3 counties. Comes from helping folks when they're down." Sarah's hands worked steadily, checking seals on the jars. "Your daddy's mine closure hit this valley hard. A lot of good men had to move on, leave families behind." Margaret absorbed this guilt, settling in her stomach like a stone. "I didn't know." "Course you didn't. You were back east living your life, same as your daddy was living his." Sarah's voice held no judgment, only weary acceptance. "But Kane lost friends when that mine shut down. His brother Jake worked there 15 years before he had to pack up and head to California." The pieces began falling into place. Kane's careful reserve, the way his eyes had hardened when she mentioned her father's name. She wasn't just a stranger in need of help anymore. She was the daughter of the man who'd brought hardship to his neighbors. "Will he turn me out?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Sarah's hand stilled on the preserving jars. She turned to study Margaret with sharp brown eyes. "Kane Morrison's got his faults, but meanness ain't one of them. He pulled you from that cliff same as he would anyone. That won't change." She paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "But earning his trust, that's different territory entirely." Margaret spent the morning helping Sarah with household tasks, grateful for work that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. But she couldn't stop thinking about Kane's expression when she'd mentioned her father, the way his whole demeanor had shifted from guarded friendliness to cold distance. Around noon, she found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching him work with a group of horses in the corral. His movements were fluid, confident, speaking of years spent in partnership with the animals. One of the mares, a paint with white markings, seemed particularly responsive to his touch. "That's Stella," Sarah said, joining her at the window. "Kane broke her himself 3 years ago. She was wild as a March wind when he brought her in, but look at her now. The mare nuzzled Kane's shoulder as he checked her hooves, trust evident in every line of her body. He's got a gift with things that have been hurt, Sarah continued. Animals mostly, but sometimes people too. Takes patience, though. Can't rush that kind of healing. Margaret understood the subtext. She was the wild thing now, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with teeth or hooves. The daughter of Thomas Sinclair, representative of everything that had gone wrong in Copper Falls. But she was also stranded, dependent on Kane Morrison's charity whether he liked it or not. The afternoon brought visitors. Two men rode up to the house, dismounted, and spoke with Kane in low voices near the barn. Margaret watched from the window as Kane gestured toward the house, his expression serious. When the conversation ended, the men tipped their hats and rode away. Kane came to the kitchen 20 minutes later, his face carefully neutral. Those men were from Copper Falls, he said without preamble. Word's gotten out about Thomas Sinclair's daughter being in the territory. Margaret's stomach clenched. What kind of word? The kind that says you're here to reopen the mine. Get folks' hopes up about jobs coming back. That's not why I came. The words came out sharper than she intended. I came to sell the property and return to Boston. Something flickered in Kane's eyes. Is that so? Yes, I have a teaching position waiting for me. Kane studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her words against some internal measure. Finally, he nodded. Then you'll need to get to Copper Falls soon as possible. Set the record straight before rumors take root. He paused, his jaw working. I can take you there tomorrow if Henry's stable enough to leave alone. Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been disappointment. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. Kane's tone was flat final. Like it or not, you're under my roof. That makes you my responsibility until I can hand you off to someone else. The words stung more than they should have. Margaret lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. I see. Well, I wouldn't want to burden you any longer than necessary. Kane's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. No burden, he said quietly. Just complicated. That evening, Margaret sat with Henry while Sarah prepared supper. The old driver was feeling well enough to sit up and take some broth, though his leg remained splinted and painful. You're worried about something? He observed, studying her face with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd spent his life reading people and weather. Margaret smoothed the quilt over his legs. Mr. Morrison knew my father. Apparently, the mine closure caused hardship here. Henry's weathered face creased into a frown. Your daddy never told you about the trouble at Copper Falls. He told me very little about his business affairs. Margaret's voice tightened. My parents were estranged. I hadn't seen him in 5 years when he died. Ah, Henry nodded slowly. That explains some things. What things? The old man was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Your daddy was a good man, Miss Sinclair, but he got caught between a rock and a hard place with that mine. Silver prices dropped, Eastern investors got nervous, and they pulled their backing right when the shaft was showing promise again. Margaret leaned forward. Are you saying he didn't want to close the mine? I'm saying your daddy fought tooth and nail to keep it open, spent his own money trying to make up the shortfall, near bankrupted himself before he admitted defeat. Henry's eyes grew distant. Last time I saw him, he was a broken man, said he'd failed everyone who depended on him. The knowledge hit Margaret like a physical blow. All these years, she'd assumed her father had chosen his business over his family, prioritized profit over people. But if what Henry said was true, why didn't he tell me, she whispered. Pride, most like, and maybe shame. Some men can't bear to show weakness even to the ones they love most. Margaret sat back in her chair, her understanding of both her father and her current situation shifting like sand beneath her feet. Kane Morrison wasn't just angry at a greedy businessman who'd abandoned his workers. He was grieving a man who'd tried and failed to save them all, including himself. The ride to Copper Falls took 4 hours through country that grew progressively more desolate. Margaret rode beside Kane in silence, the pack horse following behind, carrying supplies and her few salvaged possessions. The landscape told its own story of boom and bust, abandoned claims scarring the hillsides, empty cabins with caved-in roofs, a cemetery with too many fresh graves. Kane hadn't spoken since they'd left the ranch that morning, his attention apparently focused on the trail ahead. But Margaret caught him watching her from the corner of his eye when they passed a particularly grim reminder of the mining days. It wasn't always like this, he said finally as they crested a hill and looked down at what remained of Copper Falls. The town huddled in the valley like a wounded animal. Half the buildings stood empty windows, boarded signs faded and peeling. but smoke rose from a few chimneys, and Margaret could see people moving along the main street. Life diminished but persistent. How many stayed, she asked. Maybe a third of what was here at the peak. Stubborn folks mostly, too proud to admit defeat or too poor to leave. Kane's voice held something that might have been affection. They scratch out a living however they can. Some farming, some small-time prospecting, some just waiting for something better to come along. They rode into town slowly drawing stares from the few people on the street. Margaret felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing measuring her clothes, her posture, her resemblance to the man who'd once employed half the valley. Kane stopped in front of a weathered building with Copper Falls Hotel painted across the front. The paint was cracked and faded, but the windows were clean and curtains hung in neat folds. "Mrs. Patterson runs a decent establishment," he said, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. "She'll see you're looked after proper." Margaret slid down from her borrowed mare, her legs unsteady after the long ride. "You're not staying." Kane's eyes swept the street, taking in the small crowd that was beginning to gather. "Not my place. You've got business to conduct, and my presence might complicate things." Before Margaret could respond, a woman emerged from the hotel. She was perhaps 50 with graying brown hair, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard years gracefully endured. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent as they took in the scene. "Kane Morrison," she said warmly. "What brings you to town?" "Mrs. Patterson." Kane touched his hat brim. "I'd like you to meet Miss Margaret Sinclair. She's Thomas Sinclair's daughter, come to settle his affairs." The woman's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders. Mrs. Patterson's eyes moved from Kane to Margaret, assessing. "Miss Sinclair, I'm Eleanor Patterson. You're welcome at my establishment." The words were perfectly polite but cool. "Though I should mention I knew your father well. He was a frequent guest during the mine's operations." Margaret felt the test in those words, the careful watching that would judge her by her response. "I understand my father's business caused hardship here. I'm sorry for that." Something flickered in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. "Well, that's more than some would say." She glanced at Kane. "Will you be staying as well?" "No, ma'am. I need to head back before dark." Kane turned to Margaret, his expression carefully neutral. "I'll be at the ranch if you need anything. Mrs. Patterson will help you find your way to your father's property." He mounted his horse with fluid grace, then paused, looking down at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Be careful who you trust," he said quietly. "Not everyone in Copper Falls is as forgiving as Mrs. Patterson." Then he was gone, riding back toward the hills, leaving Margaret alone among strangers who had every reason to resent her presence. Mrs. Patterson showed her to a clean, simple room on the second floor. "Supper's at 6, she said. "Though I should warn you, word's already spreading that you're here. Folks are curious about your intentions." Margaret unpacked her few belongings, then stood at the window, looking out at the main street. Small groups of people clustered in doorways, their conversations stopping when they noticed her watching. She recognized the body language of a community bracing for either salvation or disappointment. That evening in the hotel dining room, Margaret faced her first real test. A dozen residents of Copper Falls had gathered ostensibly for their usual supper, but their attention was focused entirely on her. She ate her simple meal under their scrutiny, aware that every gesture was being catalogued and interpreted. Finally, a man at the corner table stood up. He was perhaps 40, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a miner, but his clothes were too clean, too well-maintained for someone currently working underground. "Begging your pardon, miss," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "but folks are wondering about your plans for the Sinclair property." Margaret set down her fork, her hands steady despite the flutter in her chest. "My plans are to sell the property and return to Boston." The words fell into silence like stones into still water. She watched disappointment ripple across faces, saw shoulders slump, and eyes drop to plates. "That's it then," someone muttered. "Should have known better than to hope." "Wait." Margaret stood, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Before you assume anything, perhaps you could tell me exactly what my father left behind." The miner, who'd introduced himself as Bill Hendricks, exchanged glances with his companions. "Well, there's the mine shaft itself, of course. Equipment's mostly gone, sold off to pay debts, but the infrastructure's still there. And there's the manager's house up the hill where your daddy lived when he was working the claim." "What about the mine itself? Is it truly played out?" Bill's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the thing, miss. Your daddy always claimed there was more silver down there deeper than they dug. Said the Eastern investors just lost their nerve when the easy pickings ran out. Margaret felt something stir in her chest, a familiar sensation she recognized from her teaching days when a particularly difficult problem suddenly revealed its solution. "Show me," she said. The next morning, Margaret stood at the edge of the Sinclair mine with Bill Hendricks and three other former workers. The shaft opening yawned before them like a mouth, timber supports weathered but solid. Equipment lay scattered around the site, rusted buckets, coils of rope tools abandoned when the mine closed. "Your daddy sank this shaft 200 feet, Bill explained, gesturing into the darkness. "Hit a good vein at the 100-foot mark, pulled out decent ore for 2 years. But then the vein played out, and the investors wouldn't fund deeper digging." Margaret peered into the shaft, trying to imagine her father working in that darkness day after day. "But you think there might be more below." Thomas always said so. Had surveys done, brought in experts. They all agreed the geological signs pointed to more silver deeper down. Bill kicked at a piece of ore with his boot. Problem was, it would have taken 6 months of digging with no guarantee of return. Investors wanted profit now, not maybe later. How much would it cost to reopen the mine? The question surprised everyone, including Margaret herself. Bill scratched his grizzled chin, considering. "Depends on how deep you wanted to go. Could start with maybe $500 for basic equipment and supplies. But Miss Sinclair, with respect, that's a powerful gamble for a lady from back east." Margaret walked to the manager's house that afternoon, key heavy in her hand. The building sat on a rise overlooking the mine and the valley beyond. It was larger than she'd expected, built of solid timber, with a wide porch and large windows designed to catch the mountain light. Inside, dust motes danced in the afternoon sun. The furniture was covered with sheets, but she could see her father's touches everywhere. Books on geology and mining techniques, maps of the local area, marked with his careful notations, a desk positioned to look out at the mine entrance. In the bedroom, she found a trunk she recognized from her childhood in Boston. Inside were documents, letters, and photographs that told the story Henry had hinted at. Letters to Eastern investors pleading for more time. Geological surveys supporting his theory about deeper silver veins. Personal correspondence revealing the growing desperation of a man watching his dream crumble. At the bottom of the trunk, she found a sealed envelope with her name written in her father's careful script. Inside was a letter dated just 2 months before his death. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come to Montana despite our years of silence. I pray you can forgive an old man's pride that kept me from reaching out while there was still time. I know you believe I chose business over family, but the truth is more complex. I came to Montana seeking fortune to secure your future, but I stayed because I found something more precious than silver, a community of people who depended on my success for their survival. When I failed them, I failed myself, and I could not bear to return to Boston carrying that weight. The mine holds more than I could prove to cautious investors. If you choose to sell, you will have enough to live comfortably. But if you choose to stay and dig deeper, you might find more than silver in these mountains. You might find the same thing that kept me here, even when everything seemed lost, a place where your efforts matter not just to yourself, but to everyone around you. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you more than my own life, and I am proud of the woman you have become. Your devoted father, Thomas Sinclair." Margaret sat on her father's bed, tears streaming down her face as she read the letter twice, then a third time. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the fire burning in her chest. She wasn't just her father's daughter anymore. She was the inheritor of his unfinished work, the keeper of his unrealized dreams. And tomorrow she would have to decide what to do with both. Margaret returned to the hotel that evening to find Kane Morrison waiting in the lobby. He rose when she entered, his face unreadable in the lamplight. "Thought you'd be halfway back to the ranch by now," she said, removing her gloves and setting them on the front desk. "Had some business in town." His eyes searched her face, taking in the tear stains and the dust from her afternoon at the mine. "Heard you've been asking questions about reopening the Sinclair claim." Word traveled fast in a small town. Margaret straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. "I've been learning about my father's work and his dreams." Kane's expression tightened. "Dreams don't put food on tables or keep families together when winter comes hard. I've seen what happens when folks pin their hopes on maybes and possibilities. You've also seen what happens when they give up entirely." Margaret gestured toward the nearly empty lobby, the boarded windows across the street. This town is dying, Mr. Morrison. Maybe my father's dream was all that stood between it and complete collapse. And maybe his dream was what caused the collapse in the first place. Kane's voice was low-controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. How many families lost their savings investing in Thomas Sinclair's certainties? How many men worked for promises instead of wages those last months? The questions hit Margaret like physical blows. She hadn't considered that possibility that her father's conviction might have led others to financial ruin along with their own. I don't know, she admitted quietly, but I found letters suggesting the geological signs were solid, that deeper digging might have. Kane stepped closer, his winter blue eyes intense in the lamplight. That's the problem with mining, Miss Sinclair. Might have doesn't feed children or pay mortgages. It just keeps hope alive long enough to bankrupt good people. Mrs. Patterson appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked between Margaret and Kane with the sharp eyes of a woman accustomed to reading tension. Evening, Kane. Will you be staying for supper? No, ma'am, I just came to... He paused, glancing at Margaret. To make sure Miss Sinclair was settling in all right. She's been asking sensible questions and listening to honest answers, Mrs. Patterson replied. More than some folks would do in her position. Kane nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. That's good to hear. He turned back to Margaret. A word outside. They walked onto the hotel porch where the cool evening air carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of water running over stones. Kane leaned against the railing, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. Why are you really considering this? He asked quietly. You could sell that property tomorrow, take your money and be back in Boston by Christmas. Why risk everything on a played-out mine? Margaret was quiet for a moment, searching for words that would make him understand. Because I spent 5 years being angry at my father for choosing this place over our family. Now I discover he never chose anything over us. He was trying to save something bigger than himself, something that mattered to dozens of families. She turned to face Kane directly. You said earlier that dreams don't put food on tables, but neither does despair. This town is withering because people have nothing left to hope for. Maybe that's worse than the risk of failure. Kane studied her face in the dim light from the hotel windows. And if you're wrong, if you sink money into that mine and come up with nothing but deeper holes and broken promises, then I'll have failed exactly the way my father failed, trying to do something that mattered. Something shifted in Kane's expression, a crack in the wall of his anger. You know what you'd be risking, not just your inheritance, but the hopes of every man and woman in this valley. They'll invest what little they have left if they think the mine might reopen. Their savings, their labor, their future security. Margaret felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. I know. Kane was quiet for a long moment, studying the dark mountains that surrounded the valley. Finally, he straightened, decision made. All right, he said. If you're determined to do this fool thing, you'll need help. Someone who knows mining, knows these mountains, knows which men you can trust, and which ones will take your money and disappear. Margaret's pulse quickened. You're offering to help. I'm offering to make sure you don't get swindled or worse. Kane's tone was matter-of-fact, but she caught something underneath that might have been concern. I don't want to see you hurt, and I don't want to see this town go through another disappointment. Relief flooded through Margaret's chest. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done. Kane held up a hand, stopping her words. Don't thank me yet. We haven't even started, and already I can see a dozen ways this could go wrong. He paused, then added more softly. But maybe, just maybe, it could go right. The next morning brought Margaret's first real lesson in the practical difficulties of reviving a dead mine. Kane arrived at the hotel before dawn with Bill Hendricks and 2 other former miners' men whose faces bore the permanent marks of years spent underground. First thing we need is an honest assessment of the shaft, Kane explained as they walked up the hill toward the mine entrance. Structure, water levels, gas pockets, cave-in risks. No point in risking lives or money if the mine itself isn't safe. Bill nodded agreement. Been 3 years since anyone went down there regular. Lot can change in that time. They spent the morning rigging ropes and testing the timber supports. Margaret watched from the surface as the men descended into the shaft, their voices echoing up from the darkness. When they emerged an hour later, their faces were grim, but not defeated. She'll hold, Bill announced, wiping sweat and dirt from his face. Some of the lower supports need reinforcing, and we'll need to pump out standing water, but the main structure's sound. What about the geology? Margaret asked. The signs my father thought indicated deeper silver deposits. One of the other miners, a grizzled man named Pete Carson, nodded slowly. Your daddy wasn't wrong about the rock formations. Quartz veining continues down past where we stopped digging. Question is whether it carries enough silver to make the effort worthwhile. Kane studied the mine entrance with calculating eyes. How much would it cost to go another 50 feet down? Bill scratched his chin, considering. With proper timbering and safety measures, maybe $300 in materials and supplies. Labor's cheap enough, half the men in town would work for the promise of steady wages. Margaret felt her father's inheritance weighing in her mind. After paying Henry's medical expenses and her own traveling costs, she had perhaps $800 remaining. Enough for one serious attempt, but not enough for mistakes. There's something else to consider. Kane said, his voice carefully neutral. If word gets out that you're seriously reopening the mine, you'll have company. Other investors, mining companies, folks who'll want to buy you out cheap or muscle in on any success. Margaret hadn't considered that possibility. What kind of company? The kind that plays rough when money's involved. Kane's expression was serious. Montana Territory's got more than its share of men who'll take what they want if they think they can get away with it. Bill and Pete exchanged glances, a silent communication that spoke of shared knowledge and old concerns. Your daddy had trouble with claim jumpers toward the end, Pete said finally. Men who figured a played-out mine might not be worth defending. He had to hire guards for the last 6 months of operation. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd been thinking of mining as a business venture, but apparently it came with physical dangers she hadn't anticipated. I can't ask you to risk, she began. You're not asking, Kane interrupted. I'm volunteering, and so are Bill and Pete, if I'm reading them right. Both men nodded, and Margaret saw something in their faces that went beyond mere employment. This was personal for them, a chance to vindicate their work and their faith in Thomas Sinclair's vision. All right then, she said, decision crystallizing in her chest. Let's dig deeper and see what we find. That afternoon, Margaret walked back to her father's house alone, needing time to think and plan. The building felt different now that she'd committed to staying less like a temporary shelter and more like the headquarters of an uncertain campaign. She found writing materials in her father's desk and began making lists. Equipment needed supplies to order men to hire, a dozen practical considerations she'd never had to think about in her academic life. The sun was setting by the time she finished painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold that took her breath away. A knock at the door interrupted her work. She opened it to find Kane standing on the porch, a bundle of papers in his hand and an expression of grim determination on his face. What is it? She asked, stepping aside to let him enter. Kane set the papers on the kitchen table and turned to face her. I sent some telegrams this afternoon. Called in favors from friends in Helena and Butte, men who keep their ears open about mining ventures and business dealings. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. And word's already out that Thomas Sinclair's daughter is in Copper Falls asking questions about reopening the mine. Kane's voice was flat factual. 3 different groups have made inquiries about the property in the past week. 2 mining companies and a group of Eastern investors. The room seemed to spin slightly around Margaret. They want to buy me out. Some do. Others are more interested in alternative arrangements. Kane's jaw tightened. One group's been asking about water rights and access roads. Another's been inquiring about local labor costs and security concerns. Margaret sank into a chair, the full implications hitting her. They think I'll fail, and they want to be positioned to take over when I do. That's the charitable interpretation. Kane sat across from her, his expression serious. The less charitable one is that they're planning to make sure you fail. Outside darkness was settling over the valley like a blanket, and Margaret realized that her simple plan to honor her father's memory had just become something much more complex and dangerous. What do we do? She asked quietly. Kane leaned forward, his winter blue eyes intense in the lamplight. We move fast. Get the mine operational before anyone can stop us, and hope we find enough silver to make the whole venture worthwhile. He paused, then added softly, and we watch each other's backs, because from here on out we can't trust anyone else to do it. The attack came at dawn 3 weeks into the mining operation. Margaret woke to the sound of gunfire and shouting from the direction of the mine. She threw on her clothes and ran from her father's house toward the shaft entrance, where she could see smoke rising and men scattering for cover behind equipment piles. Kane appeared at her side as she reached the mine perimeter, his rifle in hand and his face grim with controlled fury. "Stay down," he ordered, pulling her behind an overturned ore cart. 3 men on the ridge firing down at the worksite. Professional job, they knew exactly when the morning shift would be starting. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as bullets whined overhead. "Anyone hurt?" Pete took a graze on his arm, but he's mobile. Bill and the others are pinned down by the shaft entrance. Kane checked his rifle, then looked at Margaret with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, dangerous, the face of a man capable of violence when circumstances demanded it. "This isn't random claim jumping. Someone hired these men to shut us down." Another volley of shots sent splinters flying from the cart they sheltered behind. Margaret could hear the attackers calling to each other, coordinating their fire to keep the miners trapped and helpless. What do they want?" she asked. Kane's smile was sharp as winter. "Same thing vultures always want, to pick the bones clean after something dies." But Margaret had spent 3 weeks watching the mine come back to life, seeing hope return to faces that had been gray with despair since her father's dream collapsed. She thought of Bill Hendricks working 16-hour days to reinforce the shaft timbers, of Pete Carson's wife bringing coffee and sandwiches to the worksite, of the dozen families whose futures hung on what lay buried in the darkness below. "Well, they're going to be disappointed," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Kane looked at her sharply, then nodded with something that might have been approval. "There's a back trail up the ridge. If I can get around behind them—" "No!" Margaret grabbed his arm before he could rise. "Too dangerous, and it leaves us undefended down here." She paused, mind racing. But there might be another way. Margaret had noticed something during the past weeks of observation that the attackers apparently hadn't. The mine's original survey work had included drilling a ventilation shaft that emerged on the ridge above the main entrance, hidden by a cluster of boulders and scrub pine. It had been sealed when the mine closed, but the entrance was still accessible. If someone could get up there through the old air shaft, she said carefully, they could come up behind whoever's shooting. Kane's eyes narrowed. "Someone being you, I suppose." "I'm the smallest, and I know where the shaft entrance is." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "You're needed here to coordinate the defense." For a moment, Kane looked like he wanted to argue. Then another bullet cracked against the ore cart, and he nodded grimly. 5 minutes, he said. "Then I start returning fire to cover your movement." Margaret slipped away from the defensive position, using the mine buildings for cover as she worked her way to the sealed shaft entrance. The wooden boards covering the opening were weathered, but solid, held in place by rusted nails that screamed protest as she pried them loose with her fingers. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and black as the bottom of a well. She lowered herself into the darkness, feeling for handholds in the rough stone walls, and began to climb. It was the longest 5 minutes of her life. The shaft angled upward through solid rock, following a natural fissure that her father's engineers had widened just enough to allow air circulation. Margaret's hands bled from gripping the stone, her lungs burned from the stale air, and twice she nearly lost her grip entirely. But she kept climbing, driven by the sound of gunfire below, and the knowledge that good people were depending on her courage. She emerged from the shaft into morning sunlight, gasping and shaking among the boulders, 50 yards behind the attacker's position. 3 men lay prone behind a natural rock barrier, rifles trained on the mine buildings below. They were so focused on their targets that they never heard her approach. Margaret had never fired a gun in anger, but her father had taught her to shoot during their brief reconciliation attempts years ago. The rifle she'd brought from the shaft entrance felt familiar in her hands as she leveled it at the nearest attacker. "Drop your weapons," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The men spun toward her, surprise and alarm written across their faces. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the nearest man, a lean figure with cold eyes and a carefully trimmed beard, smiled with casual malice. "Well now," he said, his voice cultured despite the circumstances. "Miss Margaret Sinclair, I presume. Come to defend Daddy's lost cause." Margaret kept the rifle trained on his chest. "I said drop your weapons." The man's smile widened. "I don't think so. You see, Miss Sinclair, you're outnumbered 3-1, and I doubt very much you have the stomach for actual killing." He gestured negligently toward his companions. "These gentlemen and I represent certain interests that would prefer to see the Sinclair mine remain closed. Nothing personal, you understand? Simply business." "Whose business?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Eastern investors who remember your father's costly failure. They've decided the Copper Falls silver deposits are too valuable to be left to amateur enthusiasts." The man's tone was conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than facing each other over loaded weapons. They're prepared to make you a generous offer for the property, much more generous than you deserve considering your interference with legitimate mining operations. Margaret felt anger flare in her chest hot and clean. Legitimate operations that involve shooting at unarmed miners, regrettable but necessary. The local labor force needed to understand that reopening this mine would be inadvisable. The man took a step closer, his rifle still pointed in her general direction. But you've made your point, Miss Sinclair. Showed admirable spirit climbing up here through that shaft. Now it's time to be practical. Behind her, Margaret could hear Kane's voice shouting orders, organizing the trapped miners for what might be their final defense. She thought of Bill Hendrick's wife bringing sandwiches to the worksite, of Pete Carson's determination to prove her father had been right about the deeper silver deposits of the dozen families whose hopes she carried. "No," she said simply. The man's smile faded. "I beg your pardon. I said no. To your offer, to your threats, to your whole arrangement." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. "This mine belongs to the people of Copper Falls. It always has. My father knew that, and I know it too." The leader's expression hardened. "Then you've made a very poor choice, Miss Sinclair." He raised his rifle toward Margaret's chest just as the crack of Kane's weapon echoed from the rocks behind him. The man spun and fell, his shot going wide into the morning sky. The remaining two attackers found themselves caught between Margaret's position above and Kane's approach from their flank. The fight ended quickly professionally with the efficiency of men who understood that survival sometimes required violence. When the smoke cleared, Kane climbed the ridge to where Margaret sat among the boulders, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "You all right?" he asked, checking her for injuries with gentle hands. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The miners, shaken up but intact. Pete's arm will heal clean, and nobody else took more than scratches. Kane sat beside her on the rocks, his rifle resting across his knees. That was either very brave or very foolish climbing up here alone. Maybe both. Margaret looked down at the mine entrance, where the work crew was already emerging from cover and assessing the damage. "Will there be more trouble?" Kane followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Depends on what we find down in that shaft. If your father was right about the deeper silver deposits, word will get out, and we'll have more visitors. If he was wrong," he shrugged, "then Copper Falls dies quietly and nobody will bother us again." That afternoon, while Kane dealt with the aftermath of the attack and arranged for increased security around the mine, Margaret descended into the shaft for the first time since arriving in Montana. The elevator cage rattled and swayed as it dropped through layers of rock, carrying her into her father's dream made manifest. At the bottom, 200 feet below the surface, she found a different world. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of wet stone and timber. Lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls, revealing the careful engineering her father had put into every support beam and safety measure. Bill Hendricks met her at the bottom, his injured arm bound in clean bandages, but his eyes bright with excitement. "Come see what we found," he said, leading her deeper into the tunnel system. They walked through passages hewn from living rock, past the abandoned workings, where her father's crew had stopped digging 3 years ago. At the face of the newest excavation, barely 10 feet beyond the old works lantern, light revealed something that made Margaret's breath catch. A vein of silver ore ran through the rock face like a metallic river, pure and bright and thick enough to make a dozen families wealthy. "Your daddy was right," Bill said softly. "It was here all along, just a few feet deeper than anyone had the courage to dig." Margaret reached out to touch the silver vein, her fingers tracing the metal that had cost her father his dreams and her family their unity. But looking at it now, she understood that the real treasure hadn't been the silver itself. It had been the faith to keep digging when everyone else wanted to quit. 3 months later, Margaret stood on the porch of her father's house watching the sun set over a transformed valley. Copper Falls had come back to life with the reopening of the mine, but it was a different kind of life than before. The operation was smaller, more careful, owned collectively by the families who worked it, rather than distant investors who saw only profit margins. Kane appeared beside her, as he had most evenings since the attack, drawn by something neither of them had quite found words to name. "Telegram came from Boston today," she said, holding up a folded paper. "The Women's College wants to know when I'll be returning to my teaching position." Kane was quiet for a moment, studying the lights beginning to appear in the town below. "What did you tell them?" Margaret smiled, folding the telegram and slipping it into her pocket. That Margaret Sinclair, the Boston literature professor, has retired. But Margaret Sinclair, the mine owner, is just getting started. Kane turned to look at her, hope and uncertainty warring in his winter blue eyes. You're staying then? I'm staying. She reached for his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and honest effort. Assuming a certain rancher doesn't mind having a neighbor who's likely to cause more trouble than she prevents. Kane's response was to pull her into his arms and kiss her with all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them since the day he'd caught her falling from the sky. When they finally broke apart, Margaret rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart and the distant sounds of a community reborn. Think your father would approve? Kane asked softly. Margaret thought of Thomas Sinclair's letter, of his hope that she would find something precious in the Montana mountains. She had found silver, yes, but also something infinitely more valuable, a place where her efforts mattered, a man whose strength complemented her own, and a community that had chosen to trust her with their dreams. I think, she said, he'd be proud of what we built from his foundation. Above them, stars appeared one by one in the vast Montana sky, mapping out possibilities as endless as the territory itself. And in the valley below, the lights of Copper Falls gleamed like scattered silver, a testament to the truth that sometimes the deepest treasures are found only by those brave enough to dig beyond the easy reach of safer souls. The mine would prosper, the town would grow, and Margaret Sinclair would spend the rest of her life proving that some falls are really flights toward exactly where you were meant to land.